Well, welcome everybody. Today we're in for a special treat, and Carol Marlin's going to talk to... Sorry, Carol is going to tell us today about Kudrow, my journey into the remnants of my mother's Polish shtetl. And for those of you that don't know Carol, she has had a lifelong interest in this topic, and she's going to tell you about that. In terms of her career, after completing a term as president of New England Region Conservative Sisterhood Presidents, she enrolled at Columbia University's School of Journalism, oral history course, the preeminent leader in the field. And Columbia then hired her as a professional oral history interviewer. She then started making video memoirs, working alongside the chair of a local university's communication department. She made short documentaries that families continue to treasure. Sorry. Yeah, okay. She made short documentaries that families that she made the documentaries about still treasure to this day. For 10 years, she was a social columnist for the Jewish Advocate, and her weekly feature was What's New, was always popular. And she points out that the demise of the Advocate has been a great loss for Boston's Jewish community. She considers herself a student of 20th century Jewish history, and the Holocaust in particular. And she holds a degree, a master's degree in counseling and a master's in Judaic studies from Hebrew College in Boston. So, Carol, it's all yours. And all I can say is that Carol has put her heart into this.
Yeah, I needed to. Being 78 years old, I finally realized that a lot's aren't going the way they used to. But I'm here, and today is very exciting for me. And I hope that my sharing with you this very personal story, that you will somehow feel connected in your own way to your own story. Because as Jews growing up after the war, which we all did, we're of that generation, we share this, we encountered the Holocaust in many different ways. And our stories, I've talked to many of you, some of you are survivors or children of survivors. You certainly saw the people with numbers on their arms. No one has to convince us that there was a Holocaust, and there were terrible, terrible tragedies and horrors that went along with it. And each one of us had to come to terms with that. And I'd like to share how this happened to me. And specifically, of course, I use my mother and her shtetl, Kudrow. But I really recall the very first incident when the story of Hitler and the word that and emotions that it caused. I was 5 years old, and I can still feel myself. Is the microphone giving a... It's okay? It's okay. I can still feel myself in the back seat of a car. My sister, who was 14 years older than I am, she was 19 probably at the time, I'm about 5, and she was sitting in the front with her dear friend. She was a student at Brown, and this young woman, Rita Shaw, had been brought by the entire student body of Brown on a scholarship. She had survived. She was the only survivor of her family. And Rita was an astounding person. She came from a family they were aristocrats in the Carpathian Mountains, where her father was a mogul. He had mining. He was a professor of geology. They were a force. And there was so much about Rita that her stories were very compelling. And as her stories got more and more intimate about the details of the horror, I tried to be a non-presence. I tried to be so quiet, hold my breath. They should think this little kid in the back seat isn't listening. But I was listening. And I heard her tell the story of her father, who had built a camp in the middle of these mountains and felt safe for for quite a while until they were betrayed, and the Nazis came one day and just exposed this hiding place. And as they pulled her family out immediately to arrest, eventually they all die. Rita's the only survivor. Her cousin, her beloved cousin that she adored, is pulled out, and she tells the story how the Nazis, she's holding a 3-month-old baby, her newborn baby, and he rips that baby out of her arms, takes it by its feet, and slams it against a tree. At 5 years old, that story becomes a nightmare, and it recurs in my life, what I used to call my Nazi nightmares. All the psychologists in this audience can do what they will with my dreams. But in any case, this is my journey, and I would love to hear somehow your journey too. Let me tell you a little bit about Kudrow. See if this works. Kudrow, the middle of Poland, that's that little red dot. It's in between Lublin and Warsaw, as you can see, closer to Lublin, as my mother would say, or Vasha, than to Vasha. But she used to think it was a little closer to Vasha because that's where her mother's family was from. But if you look at the general picture of Poland, you see on this side is Lithuania, Belarus, Minsk, Ukraine, Russia, and here is Germany and the rest of Europe. Poland, the center, often the crossroads in war. And in World War I, my mother was born in 1907, and I want to make this very clear. This is not a story of her survival of the Holocaust. She leaves Kudrow in 1920. But what she takes with her are the feelings, the culture, so much of the richness of life that you got to see in the scenes that you watched. And she brought them into our home. And it's her stories that really I want to share with you. But the next, okay. I like this next slide because do you notice the town of Chelm? Have some of you heard of Chelm? Chelm, I was brought up on the stories of Chelm at a conservative Sunday school. The people of Chelm were called the wise man of Chelm, and everybody who grew up as a kid knew that the wise men were really foolish, stupid people, and did everything wrong with a good, meaningful, their hearts were filled with goodness, but everything turned out wrong for them. My mother would say, you know, there's a real Chelm in Poland, but everyone from Kudrow knows that the people that the stories are about are really about Kudrow. So that was something about the people. So, this is, when I was about 11, 12, 13, this book came into my life. It sits here. This is the Yiska book that is published about Kudrow. My mother had left in 1920, and obviously we know all the turmoil that follows through. And this book changes so much of the atmosphere in my home. My Zadie reads every word. My mother reads every word. It's 90% in Yiddish, 98% in Yiddish. There's a little bit of English and there's a little more of Hebrew because the book is published in Tel Aviv. And the people who publish, there are 2,000 of these Yiska books from the tens of thousands of communities that were demolished. Kudrow published quite a substantial book for a town that's only 4,000 people. 2,000, a little more, 2,200 about are Jews. 52% are Jews, 48% are Christians, Catholics, because Poland is a Catholic country. And they live for hundreds and hundreds of years, fairly well put together. They managed. It's a viable community. And then, of course, it isn't. It's totally, Kudrow today has nothing, not a morsel of Jewish remains in it that you can touch. The editor of this book, Mr. Grossman, writes, I neglected to say, my role evolved in my life, and so now that I am the project coordinator of the Yiska Book Project, that's the translation of these books into English, because while they're written in Yiddish, and it's understandable why they're written in Yiddish, because this is the language that they experienced these horrors, and that's what this was part of the release that they had to have by telling these stories, but they had to know that the future was not Yiddish. So much so that Mr. Grossman writes a small introduction in English, and I think it's very interesting that he does that. But I have an interesting new slide that I just put in this morning. This is Avram Grohl. He is the executive director of Jewish Gen, who is in charge of the translation of these Yiska books. And if I can, oops, why can't I go back? I can't see. Will you help me? Let me see. Oh, nope. Okay.
Hi, Carol. This is Abraham Grohl. I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak briefly about the importance of the Yisker Book Project. As you are probably aware, Yisker books, which are memorial books, were written by Holocaust survivors in the immediate decades after the war, mostly, and they were designed to perpetuate legacy and memory of Jewish communities that had existed in many cases for hundreds of years before they were destroyed during the Holocaust. And these books consist of histories of the towns, biographical sketches of famous personalities, what life was like during holidays and at different time periods, and ultimately all end, or mostly all end, with chapters about what happened to the town's inhabitants during the Holocaust. And this has been one of our most important projects at Jewish Gen because it's providing testimony, firsthand testimony from survivors about what happened during the war and what life was like, what the stories that they received growing up. And it is something that we are giving to future generations when they wish to learn about their family history and heritage. This is something that can help give them context to the lives of their ancestors. So at Jewish Gen, we not only want people to identify relatives, but we want to provide information about how their relatives might have lived.
So Mr. Grossman, again I come back to him, the editor of this Yiska book, puts this phrase, and I think it's very telling: books that are graves, tomes that are tombs. The graves, and he writes, I'll just read a little bit from the introduction. The graves and tombs of the 10 preceding generations were torn out by their roots and reduced to nothing. And all of those of our brethren who were tortured and tormented by the Germans with the aids of Poles and Ukrainians now lack that place of rest, which is the ultimate bourne of all mortals. Even their bones were ground up and used as manure, and a last shameful and total annihilation. And therefore it is all the more necessary to keep the thought of them green in our hearts, our souls, and our memories. Today, our hearts and our thoughts establish a covenant with the memory of you all, never to forget you until the end of our days. This Yiska book appears in Israel, and it means that, in a sense, we have brought you to a Jewish grave after the custom of Israel. I'm going to keep it here for a while because I want to get back to what was life like during the time, because as Mr. Grohl tells us, the Yiska books are divided basically in two, and so is this one. The majority about what life was like. What did we lose when 6 million of our own were murdered? And what did they go through? And that's the second part. But the vast majority, and it's so important that we understand that our culture will never be the same. We lost so much. Just think of the brain power, everything that we did lose. But so reviewing the time, I think just very briefly, 1917, the Balfour Declaration. Many of us know that as a line of history. That's when the British declared that the Jews will have a homeland in Palestine. That's a line in history book. But when I read it in the Yiska book, and I read a chapter, how that totally excited and transformed the population. All of a sudden, after praying for coming home to a place after 2,000 years, the dream is going to be a reality. And it turns into a whole group of Zionists, and many different kinds of Zionists. Some become violent even. There's communists who actually murder people, and there's socialists, and the Betar, and there's Zhabatinsky comes to talk, and if you know anything about history and who he is, some people call him a terrorist, and then the religious Jews and the non-religious Jews, but all want to go to Palestine. And of course the tragedy is that the resources are not there, and the politics change, and you can't get there. So many of the people who want to get there are not able to, and are ultimately murdered. And that's discussed very much in this book. One of the interesting things is that the religious Zionists, under the auspices of their rabbi, a man called Abramowitz, go to a place called Bnei Brak. And maybe some of you know Bnei Brak because that's mentioned in a Haggadah when they talk about the saying of the Shema. Bnei Brak hadn't been inhabited for centuries by any Jews, but he brings a contingent and he settles there. And in today, anybody who knows anything about modern Orthodoxy, Bnei Brak, not Jerusalem, is the center of Orthodox rabbinic life. And that's just the way it is. So it's fascinating that this tiny little town sends the first people to that place. It's significant in that world. So there are chapters about the Beis Midrash. This is a small but very important meeting place that's attached to the synagogue. There's one main synagogue. There are other synagogues, little shtubels, my mother would say, in Kudrow. But there's one main one, and that main synagogue has a Beis Midrash. It's really the community center where all the men go to talk the politics of the day, maybe do some learning and praying and fetching. And the women come every Friday afternoon. I remember my mother telling me they would bring their stew, their cholent, and they would put it in the oven. There was always 24/7 in those cold Polish winters. There was always a warm place in that Beis Midrash. And they would bring their stew and put it in so it would cook overnight, and they would then on Shabbos afternoon take it back for their Shabbos lunch. That was part of the tradition there. All of this, so much of it lost. There was a lending library. I love this too, that, it was actually illegal to have a real library, so they had to do it sort of undercover and without the authorities really knowing. And they bought books and they shared them among the community. It was a community that sought to better themselves. So going back a little bit to this Yiska book, I'm 12 years old. I'm taking you back and forth, and I apologize. But I'm 12 years old, and I remember this image. It says underneath in English, this is one of the English phrases I find, 1 German soldier injured, 10 Jews from Kudrow hung. I show you this slide. I'm sort of reluctant to show it to you, but to actually do it. But I was interviewed on April 21st, 2020, the Yiska book. Again, I'm the new head of this project, and there's a wonderful, I don't know how it survived COVID, I really don't know, but there was a wonderful Holocaust center at the Bristol Community College in Fall River, where I grew up. By the way, I'd like to say that I was born in Fall River, but in many ways I feel I was raised in Kudrow because of my mother. And so I was interviewed by a woman who was working with me, and it's April 21st, 2020, and the significance is my husband turned 78 on this day, and 8 days later he dies of COVID, and I have COVID during this interview. So all this is going on in the background, and somehow this book is in my life. Oh, okay. And getting back to the book itself and my mother leaves in 1920. It's after World War I. And as I showed you in the map, Kudrow and Poland is the crossroads of World War I. And just before World War I, her father and mother face a crisis. My grandfather is a little bit of a cattleman and a butcher, but a lousy businessman. And his cattle develop a lung disease, so they're all non-kosher, because if it affects your lungs, the cow's lungs, it's treif. You can't sell it as kosher. So he lost all his profits, was in debt. How was he going to support this family? He has a brother in America who offers to send him a ticket, and despite his wife's protestations, he decides to go to America and leave his family and says, in 6 or 7 months, I will send for you. And he was a man committed to his family very highly. And, but what happened? There was, the Archduke is assassinated, and World War I erupts overnight. And my grandparents, my mother and her sister and brother and mother are separated from their father for almost 7 years. It's a horrible, horrible experience for them.
When the Germans were coming to conquer our little shtetl, we all hid. And then when the Germans came in and the Russians counterattacked, the Germans came and they told us that we should better evacuate the city, that they were going to put out gas to gas the soldiers. And they didn't want the civilian population to get gas. So we had to run to another city. And as we were running, the bullets were flying over our heads. People were getting killed. And we were always, I remember my mother always reciting the Shema, because as she was reciting it, we were all reciting it with her, because we didn't know when the next bullet was going to strike us, but somehow we got to that other city, and it seems that the Germans didn't have to put gas out, and we were able to come back to our city, but it took about a week.
So, my mother told this story to me many times, and I do know that my bubby also told me that they lived in a hole for several days. Can you imagine? I mean, the horror of this. She came out shaking. She said she had that shake for her entire life. This is a little aside too. It was very hard to put together in 40 minutes what the highlights are. But I know there's so much interest in Yiddish in this group. There's now a new Yiddish group, and my mother speaks a Polish Yiddish, but the Yiddish that's more sophisticated, supposedly, is those of Lithuania. And it's not unlike the fact that Australians and Scottish people speak English that sometimes I have a very difficult time understanding. And I'm just curious to see what you think of my mother's Yiddish. So I have a lot of tapes of my mother, but this one, I did tape her a little bit in Yiddish, although I do not understand Yiddish, and I certainly can't read it, but here. Nope. I can't make it work. Can you make it work, Ashley? This is Ashley, who thankfully came into my life at the right time to help me.
Immer noch etliche Wochen in der
Please follow
Deutschen,
this in English.
aber ins Verdrimmen.
Yeah. What happened?
Die Deutschen dann sind nicht gewesen so schlecht wie in der Zweiten Weltkrieg. Sie haben uns nicht ausgehakt. Aber sie haben uns zugenommen in unser ganzes Essen. Sie haben sie konfiskiert, die ganze Schreures, was Menschen haben gehabt in sehr Krümmen. Und sie haben uns gelost Uhren. Die Menschen sind gefallen wie Fliegen von Hunger. Mama hat auch verloren, die Kinder. Wenn ich allein bin gewesen, geschwommen von Hunger. Man hat uns noch gegeben, ein kleines Stück Gebäude mit 2, 3 Potatoes. Und mit dem hat man gedacht, leben. Ich habe gehabt, ich weiß nicht, wie ich bin geblieben leben. Von die alle Hingerige, dass ich bin gewesen.
So my mother does get finally to leave. she talks sometimes about the fact that the war that ended for us in 1918 didn't end at all. The Poles go to war with the Bolsheviks, and so I think there's a lot of turmoil in Europe, and so just to get out takes them so long. It took them over a year to get. These are her documents. I thought you might be interested in seeing from 1920 what her mother and my mother. I also have my father's documents from 1913. These are original. So my mother comes to Revere, where she graduates high school. She becomes engaged. She is a pretty woman, and I love this picture. It kind of floated up one day, several years ago, in my house. I have no idea what made me really look at it very closely, and I'm sure it's because it's addressed to David Brenner. That's my Zadie, my grandfather, on Shirley Avenue in Revere, Mass. For those of you who know what Shirley Avenue in Revere, Mass. is, I see some heads shaking. You know that was a real Jewish street. You know exactly where my Zadie's butcher store was. So this is from Poland. This is a Yiddish newspaper written in Warsaw. And as I said to you, when my grandmother had to leave her family and say goodbye, it wasn't like there was a possibility you could pick up a phone every Sunday and say hello, or you could send a letter that would arrive in 3 or 5 days. You were saying goodbye, and your contact with the people you loved so much was very tenuous, very tenuous. But yet they maintain that close relationship. And so here are the people in Warsaw hearing that there's going to be a wedding in Revere. And they put on the front page of this Yiddish newspaper, I take a picture, and in the bottom right column of the front page is this little blurb. And I love it because it gives a mazel tov. Here I'll use this. It gives a mazel tov to David Brenner, my Zadie, and his wife, and for the marriage of their daughter, Liebe Frandl. And I particularly love this because my one and only beautiful granddaughter's name is Liebe Frandl. She's named after my mother. And she marries Benjamin Simon in Revere, Revere, Massachusetts. Oh, Revere. Here it is, Revere. Anyway, Revere, Massachusetts. And I also like this part where it says Sarah Rickel, because that's my Yiddish name, Rickel. And this was my great-grandmother, and her, this is Sarah Rivka Rickel, Scheinbach, and her sons and daughters. And I think it's very touching that somehow this survived, this congratulations, that trying to hold on to the family. And as a matter of fact, that family does hold on to each other. And my children's children are friends with the children's children of these people. So they live in Israel, and it's wonderful to see that somehow this connection has stayed. So my mother comes, she has 2 children, my sister and brother, Louisa George, and then in this, she commissions this picture when my sister is 14 and my brother is 11, and I always used to like to say, I'm in that picture, because my mother commissions this. She thinks she's not going to survive because she was frail in many ways, a strong woman, a woman of great purpose, and one that I admired so much. But there was a frailty about her from her early life. And I love this picture because it's my mother and I, and I'm a little girl. When I found this picture very recently, just putting together things for today, it's not the best photography, but what I love about it, it's revealed to me what my role in life was at the earliest time. It was to be my mother's doll. And I think that I was her doll until, believe me, I wasn't. So these are her parents, and I like to show this picture. It says a lot about me, too. This is my Zadie, and in his naturalization papers, it says he's 5'7". And here is my Bubby standing beside him, almost as tall as he is sitting, in the chair. She's almost 4. She's probably 4'9" by 4'9". You know, this is my genetic pool. Okay, so this is what my mother said briefly about her.
So they had a beautiful life. My father never called my mother any other name but my darling and you're the crown of my head. He loved my mother so much. The poor people in Europe were so disgusted. They used to fight and they used to do a lot of cursing. But in my house, I never knew what it meant, a curse word.
I love this picture because you understand my mother is the only survivor. My grandmother had 6 live births, and my mother is the only survivor. And she felt an obligation when she was offered scholarship to college. She said no, she had to, it was her duty to get married and have a family because that's what her parents wanted from her.
Go home, as I told you, with all the girls from school every day. We'd fool around, we'd joke, we'd laugh. But when Friday, I was the first one out of school. I ran so I should be able to be home and help my mother prepare for the Sabbath. I should be able to wash her floor, to wash the steps, and make the house holy for the Holy Sabbath. And my father, the Sabbath in our house was like the struggles of the whole week were gone. It was like a new atmosphere. It was so beautiful. My father used to come home Friday night and say the blessings. And my mother used to, all week long, she didn't have time to prepare the best meals. But for the Sabbath, our meals were beautiful, and the table was set, and the candles were lit, and the beautiful white tablecloth. And my father always brought home well, they call it in Hebrew, an oirech, I guess. Whenever a rabbi came to the shul, my father brought him home as a guest in our house to eat. My mother always prepared much more than for our family, because she always knew that my father will always bring home 1 or 2 guests. Even on my father's stone is written that he was matnas orach, that means he fed the hungry who came to the city. He believed like Abraham, the first Jew, he was always, people that passed by, he always invited them in, according to the Bible, for dinner, to eat. And when they used to want to thank him, he used to say, no, don't thank me, thank God. And that's how Abraham got converts. But my father didn't have to get converts. They were religious people. He only took the most religious people to our house because he figured those that weren't so religious that passed by, they can go any place. But our house was very pious and my mother was very strict with her kashrut.
So he used to have like rebbes and people come, didn't
Okay,
he?
I'm going to go into this. So I skip around and I apologize because sometimes I would change this whole order. We're going back a little bit to the Yizka book where it we're going back to Kudrow a little bit. And this is a book, which I also have a copy I brought down. It's called Jewish Art in Europe in Synagogues. And what is so interesting is that Kudrow, this tiny little inconsequential little town, is featured, their synagogue, which someone points out, reveals that this congregation is, at least there were graves that 500-600 years old. the Jews lived here. And this shul obviously was prosperous enough, the community at one time, to build a substantial shul with this beautiful Aron Kodesh, and there's other pictures in the book.
We had a very
Ooh. So back in Kudrow, my mother.
when my grandmother lived with us, and as I told you, I saw the rich children go to school, and I cried that I couldn't go. And my grandmother used to do business with a lot of the people that organized the school. So she went to them and she begged them, please take her in. As soon as her father starts sending money, the first money will pay you for her education. So they let me go to school. And I was the happiest person in the world that I was able to go
to school. My mother was fortunate because there was a phenomenon in Poland around the time of the First World War, when there was something called the Talbot schools, maybe some of you have heard of, but there were these, the Jewish agency, different, as I said, the Balfour Declaration made people think of Israel, but there was a sense that they had to modernize education. Most of the children were sent to Cheder, very traditional. They learned, traditionally a girl just learned the prayers, and it was very limited. And they opened this modern school. And my mother talks, as you hear, that she was exposed and she wanted to go, and she does get to go to this wonderful school that really changed her life, where she learns literature and German and Polish and Russian and Yiddish as a real language with a literature, and Hebrew and modern Hebrew. She studies Bialik, as Hebrew is developing into a modern language, she is learning it. And I have no real understanding of what the school was that she actually went to, but in this book I find this picture, and I studied this picture, and underneath in English it does say 1916, so I know my mother is in Kudrow when this picture is taken. And I study it, and I see a picture of this little girl. And I go back and I realize in my mind, is this picture from 1936, 8 years before I'm born, my parents and my sister and brother, and that picture of that little girl, and here is my sister Louise and this little girl. And in my mind, at a very young age, I don't know why I never speak to my mother about it, I decide that this is my mother.
That was my grandfather.
Which one?
Okay, so now I want to tell you a little bit about mining this book, because in this book, these Yizka books are precious to everyone, but for me, knowing that the pictures, for example, that you saw in the beginning when you came and you see this old movie, I know all the people here, they're murdered. I mean, there are only about 150 survivors of Kudrow, of the 2,000 people who lived there. And most of them are herded the very beginning of the war. In 1940, most of you know that this is the beginning of World War II. Germany invades Poland. So it's not very long after that Kudrow is invaded. And it's a Friday night, and the stories that do come out are that it's a Friday evening, and the Germans come and they ransack everything. They call all the Jews to gather into the central courtyard. They burn the shul. They burn all the houses of the Jews. They totally destroy everything Jewish in this town. And so, getting back to, so I mine this book for any remnants I can find of my family and the little bit that I do know of it. And so my mother talks about this grandfather, and so this is my great-grandfather. He was quite a character. He appears in this book in the strangest places and in the strangest ways. So I want to share a little bit to you, oh, this is not what I wanted. So, oops, my mother talks about him. Nope.
That was my grandfather.
Which one? Which?
His name was Eli.
The one from
Elia.
Abraham?
From Abraham. He was the youngest boy. He was so strong that once about 30 hooligans came into our little shtetl and they wanted to kill the Jews. And my grandfather was such a strong man, such a hero. He went out and he fought that was the story. I don't know, but there's a lot of legend to it, that he went out and fought the 30 hooligans and he put them all away.
He tells you how he did it, right?
Yes, he closed his fists with a stone in it, and as they came, he gave them each a bang in their face. He would have been a prize fighter here, and he saved the city. And they told that story for years and years, that my grandfather saved the city from a pogrom.
So, this is the story. I don't find that story in the Yiska book, but I find this story of my great-grandfather. Eli the butcher stabs Lilith. Now, one thing you should know is that the culture is filled with spirits and demons and superstitions. I mean, my mother, I gave my poor mother such a hard time every time she said, you have to do this or you can't whistle in the house, all her superstitions. But maybe some of you also have heard of them. But they were very real to these people who, never knew from the day to day what was going to happen. So Eli the butcher, let me tell you, Eli was afraid of nothing. In Kudrow there was once an epidemic on young children, and many baby boys did not survive their circumcision or their bris. And many baby girls did not live to be honored by their fathers by being named in the synagogue. Then a rumor started to circulate that Lilith, or as some called her, Queen Sheba, queen of the demons and spirits, had appeared in town and was suffocating the children at night. One night, Eli stuck his knives under his belt and went home alone. He had entirely forgotten about the earlier story of Lilith's appearance. And going by the cemetery, he heard the melodious voice of a woman calling him by name, "Eli, my love, come to me, my beauty." Eli looked and saw a beautiful woman leaning on the other side of the fence. He was entranced by her beauty. She very nearly ensnared him in her net. His brain started to work quickly. She reached out to him with her beautiful white hands and again called to him. She looked like a living person and not like a demon. She leaned toward him as she wanted to caress his face. Eli stepped closer to her, and she tried to throw her arms around his neck. And at that moment, Eli grabbed one of his knives and stabbed her in the chest. She cried out, "Oi!" and disappeared. Eli never again used that knife. From then on, Lilith disappeared from Kudrow. Children remained living and grew in number, and may they increase. So, this is Eli's daughter. And very interesting to me, my mother often talks about her for various reasons. And she's she also here is listed as the warden of the Hever Kadisha, the burial society. And her husband was the shamus, or the gabbai of the synagogue, like the sort of the learned janitor, I guess. But she was married at age 14, had 18 children, some say 20 children. Many of them were murdered, but several came to the United States. And something I started to say to you was the survivors, that night, that Friday night when they came, when the Germans came, and they gathered all the Jews into the courtyard. Almost all the Jews that they gathered in the courtyard that night were put in, the camps, Sobibor and others, they were right in this area of Poland, the death camps. And these people were among the first murdered. But those who didn't go and who somehow had were brave enough to defy the order to appear, most of the survivors are in that group. And many of them spend the war in hiding. And in the woods, they become partisans. And quite a few of my relatives who do survive become partisans, like some of her children. But most of them do perish There are a few that that I met that did come to this country, but most perish. One little boy and girl do survive and write a lot about their travails as young children living in the woods. And these are some of her descendants, pictured in this Yiska book, all of them murdered. Mother Rachel emerges from her tomb and sees the Jews on their last road going to the Hitlerite gas chambers. And finally, I'd like to close with this one story. She's not a relation that I know of. I mean, maybe she is. My mother speaks about the Chazan, the cantor in the big shul, and he's often mentioned. And he's mentioned with the most endearing way, not only for his beautiful voice, but he was a man of great culture and humanity, and he had 11 children. And this woman is the youngest. And they all come at that Friday night when they were supposed to come into the center of the town, and they're all murdered. But she doesn't go. Somehow I don't remember exactly the details why she doesn't, but she doesn't go. And she's a very attractive woman, and she spends a lot of the years of the war as a Christian. She has blonde hair and blue eyes. My mother did too. There was some mingling of various reasons, and some Jews didn't look very Jewish, and she was successful as a Christian and lived and went to church and had to say the rosary. Here she's a pious woman, and she's saying the rosary and doing these things and probably eating a lot of treif just because she was into surviving. And it's amazing to me how these stories, these people go from Kudrow to Warsaw to Lublin to all over. They're running and running, trying to just survive. But she spends a lot of time in Warsaw, in this Christian's home, right across from the Warsaw Ghetto, where she does have contact, and she's a very brave woman. And I didn't really know the details of the story because all I saw were these pictures of her, as I show you. But there was something glamorous about her, something that interested me. I didn't understand any of the pages of story that surrounded these pictures, but there was something about her, and it mentions her nephew Chaimel, and I wondered about her. And it was not until this chapter was translated into English that her story comes alive to me, and that in fact, as a Christian, she was there when the Warsaw uprising, and she sees it in such a different way than we see heroes, and it's quite remarkable. And she writes how she decided after the war that she had survived to go back to Kudrow and to see. She almost expected things to be the way they were when she left. But when she gets there, she said, "I left even faster than I traveled there. There were no more Jews in Kudrow. All of Kudrow is a cemetery. I recognize nothing. Our house where I spent my childhood and youth together with my parents, sisters, brothers, beloved nephews, girlfriends. Where did it all go? I don't even recognize the place. I want to run to the old familiar cemetery to cry my heart out, and all I find is a plowed up field with cows grazing, even the Lublin road up to the post office unrecognizable. But there's nothing left. The rest is empty, as though it never held any life." And so, but the one happy ending to the story is that she does go to Israel, she does survive, and she does have this child, who I often wonder about what happened to the little Yesky. And I told you about my nightmares. I had them until I found the love of my life and got married, and my Nazi nightmares disappear, and we together build this beautiful family, and somehow try to carry on a little bit, making life as good and wonderful as we can. So I thank you very much, and welcome if they have any questions. Yes, if there are any questions.
So for questions, we all speak into the mic just so that we have the people on channel 918 can hear? So any questions?
I came late for the pictures at the beginning. I was here for your whole talk, but could you show those again?
Sure. When we conclude, I'll put it on, and you can see it as you leave. Sure.
The question I have, did they have a Hebrew Free Loan Society in
They did.
the village?
Do you know what's very interesting? There was a wealthy man who actually, less to the non-Jews, but to the Jews, decided that there was such poverty in Kudrow that he granted everyone in the town a stipend just because he wanted to do it. It changed life for a little while for these people who were so desperate. This was sometime in the 30s. But yes, there was such a thing. I mean, there was a real community. They really helped each other. That's how they survived. I don't think they could have without that. Any other
Have
questions?
Any other questions? You didn't have one? Okay.
I don't think so.
Oh, he's one.
Carol, who was in this
Oh,
picture?
this is my 2 sons, their wives, my husband, and my 8 grandchildren. Okay, so I want to go back to, okay, yes, Adam, my son Adam. This is my son Adam, by the way. Yes, my other son David, who wanted to be here.
The stories that you mentioned in this book are of just one book. You mentioned that there's 2,500 of these books. How typical are these stories that you saw in the history of that community are in each of these books, and what's going on with those books?
Well, there are about 200 books that are active, have been translated, of the around 2,000 official Yiska books that exist. And that's not a very large number. But one of the things I did want to mention, and I almost forgot, is my thank yous. This took a lot of thought on my part to put together, but I have some people that I need to thank. First and foremost, Michael Thorner, who does such a wonderful job with these. He put up with a lot, putting up with me. And Larissa, of course, who does such an outstanding job, as Susan Titus did. And to people like Mark Levine and Joanne Levine, who supported this project financially, to Lance Ackerfeld, who is in charge of the Jewish Gen. He does an outstanding job for the Yiska books. And some of the people who helped me along the way, I'll just say their names: Vivian Gross, Leah Williams, and I have to tell you about Gabriel Neidich Friedman, who is a grandson. I put out a call because I know we have the most fantastic grandchildren in the world, in our community. And I was just looking for someone to come help me because I thought I could do this, but putting these slides together was a challenge. And Gabriel was the one who, the grandson of the Nadiches, and he was such a wonderful, wonderful young man, and I'm so happy that he helped me so much. And he's now a freshman at Columbia and the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I wish him all the best, and thank you very much for having him, and that he was part of our community. And then now I find Ashley Reyes, who is here with me today, who popped up, and I knew I would need her because she filled in and has done so much to help me put this together and make a slideshow. Yes.
This isn't a question, it's actually another answer to Adam, because there's a whole section on jewishgen.org about Yisker books and which ones exist. They list them for every town, although they're not all translated and processed. And the Yiddish Book Center has translations of a lot of them, which you can order as a single copy if
Yes.
you have
Well,
one
they
for
have
your
the
town. But, well, they're not selling the original, but they have the translation, and you can buy it for your town if it exists.
They have copies. The Yiska, Adam has one. The copies of these Yiska books in Yiddish, you can buy at the Yiddish Book Center. Yes, okay, but they do have they have as many that are online with the New York Public Library. You can also go to the New York Public Library and see the original Yiska books. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.